there's many iterations of this idea of uniting Nuestra America, our America, against the empire, because you have one huge empire like the US and then multiple Balkanized nations to the south. The goal is always to revive that.
There is obviously that sense of national sovereignty, national liberation, but also internationalism right at the core of Sandinismo, just as much as, say, the Cuban Revolution or the Bolivarian Revolution and so on. Would you like to say something about that at some level, which again doesn't make sense for some Europeans or North Americans and their understanding of what nationalism is? You know, nationalism is always just this one sort of bourgeois thing. That there are these different versions of nationalism that are already kind of international as well. Because I guess one thing about Nicaragua and Venezuela and Cuba, Bolivia, hence Alba, for example, is that in addition to taking care of their own national business, as it were, what they're trying to do is build up a continental sense of unity strong enough to finally defeat the empire in the north.
100%. And it's a really fascinating history that is connected to internationalism, because a lot of times people in the imperial core in the first world, they'll see nationalism and they think it's like British nationalism or US nationalism, but it's very different, because the nationalism of oppressed nations is usually against empire, because they came about in a totally different way. Like, for example, like Irish nationalism versus like British nationalism is totally different because of the histories of the struggles of the people. And in a way, we can see the same thing with Latin America and the Caribbean. In Nicaragua, in the case of Nicaragua, it's interesting because Nicaragua in the 1800s was part of the Central American Federation, the United Provinces of Central America, which was led by Francisco Morazán, who was a revolutionary independence leader in the same era of Simón Bolívar, at the time when he oversaw La Gran Colombia, which included Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and what is today Panama. And so there were multiple waves. Like, we talk about the pink tide, but there were multiple eras of that and multiple eras of Latin American unity in what this idea called Nuestra America, or our America, which was coined by Jose Marti, who was a Cuban revolutionary. So going back to the 1800s, the independence movement of Nicaragua formed part of the United Provinces of Central America. So the 5 Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Costa Rica, were one federation that was united. And at that point, they sought independence from the Spanish, who had colonized the region for obviously hundreds of years. And at that point, they were battling against the US and British-backed nationalists who wanted to balkanize the country. And so if you go to Nicaragua, the Caribbean coast, there's a lot of English names, Corn Island, Bluefields. And the reason is because the British at that point wanted naval control of the region. Nicaragua is one of the thinnest parts of the Western Hemisphere between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And the biggest fear has always been for a canal to be constructed in Nicaragua that was under the control, because at that point, Central America could have been the biggest naval power in the hemisphere. They had access to not only the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but also North and South. They could control all trade that goes on in that region. The British wanted a slice of that, so they colonized what is today the Mosquito Coast. And they actually supported, so even the support of the weaponizing the Mosquito people against the Revolutionary Sandinista government was also a tactic used by the British against Francisco Morazán and the Central American Federation. So that was one interesting aspect. And so at that point, Francisco Morazán was murdered in battle. The Central American Federation was dissolved in the mid-1800s. And in the mid-1800s, toward the mid-1800s, 1850s, you had William Walker, who was a U.S. filibuster with the name of that at the time, a colonizer, a pirate, who declared himself president of Nicaragua. And he went to Nicaragua. He wanted to create what was called the Golden Ring, a really horrible idea that basically he wanted to create a ring around the southern U.S., the Caribbean coast of Central America, and the Caribbean coast of South America, and make it into a giant slave plantation that would be an annex of the Southern Confederacy. And he wanted to establish Nicaragua as the first colony of that. He was assassinated by a man named Florencio Satruch, who came from Honduras. And there has always been unity between Hondurans and Nicaraguans because of that. So there's a lot of internationalism. Again, Francisco Morazán, who was the leader of the Central American Federation, was actually in the same lodge as Simón Bolívar, La Logia Lautaro, which at that time was used to organize against the Spanish. That's a whole other discussion, but it's interesting because that sort of internationalism has always played a role, and their goal was to create the United States of Latin America. So there's times where it arises and disappears. So moving forward into the 1920s, you have Sandino. Sandino, born in a region called Segovia, a very impoverished area, northern bordering Honduras. And he openly talks about reviving Bolivar's dream, of Morazán's dream, uniting Nicaragua with the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean. And Sandino goes on to do so. Interestingly enough, in the 1920s, Sandino makes a friend, a very close acquaintance by the name of Farabundo Martí, who was the founder of the Communist Party of Central America. He was from what is today El Salvador, which Farabundo Martí was to El Salvador what Sandino is to Nicaragua. He inspired the FMLN guerrilla movement in the 70s and the 80s. Farabundo Martí and Sandino collaborated. They wanted to revive the idea of a united Central American Federation as a socialist federation. Because again, this is the 1920s. This is the height of the Soviet Union. They were very inspired by the Russian Revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union, and wanted to have something similar in Central America, because this way they would be able to unite and defeat the US, which was the rising imperial power. And Farabundo Martí and Sandino collaborated a lot. Sandino also was in close contact with José Carlos Mariátegui in Peru, who was the founder of the Communist Party of Peru, and also wrote about what he called Indo-America, uniting an indigenous federation of socialists in Latin America and the Caribbean. So again, there's many iterations of this idea of uniting Nuestra America, our America, against the empire, because you have one huge empire like the US and then multiple Balkanized nations to the south. The goal was always to revive that. And again, into the 1960s, when the Sandinista Front was founded, Tomás Borge, Carlos Fonseca, and others, they also had this idea of creating a united socialist Central America and Latin America. They were deeply inspired by the Cuban Revolution, the Algerian Revolution, hence why they were called the National Liberation Front, and they added Sandinista to it to adapt it to Nicaragua. They were deeply inspired as well by Grenada and the New Jewel movement and Maurice Bishop. They were also deeply inspired by the socialist movements in South America as well. So a lot of collaboration, a lot of unity between the different movements in the 60s and 70s, again, with this vision of uniting socialist Latin America, which is why you see, for example, the Sandinista flag is red and black, which is also the flag of the July 26 movement in Cuba, the revolutionary movement, also the flag of the ELN in Colombia, also the flag of the MIR in Chile, the Movimiento de Izquierda Revolucionaria. So that became sort of the banner of uniting socialist movement in Latin America at that time. And even to this day, Nicaragua is extremely internationalist. They work very closely with Russia, China, Cuba, Bolivia. They have conferences. I got to visit a school called IALA, the Agroecological Institute of Latin America, where they bring students from working class backgrounds all over Latin America and the Caribbean to teach them how to farm, teach them how to grow crops in very hostile areas. And they're passing on that knowledge of internationalism through food sovereignty, through socialist education. So at its root, Nicaragua, not only the Sandinista revolution, but the Nicaraguan people have been deeply internationalist. I think not only because they're the center of Central America, but the center of the Americas. So they're at the heart of America.